Welcome to the Biology 182 Evolution series. This video will help students understand the concept of a species. At the end of this video, students should be able to explain the ideas that develop the species concept, as well as understanding what species are. When Darwin was writing on origin of the species in the 1850s, he postulated that there was no real working definition of what a species was, that all the naturalists of the time could not agree upon one definition, but that each naturalist actually understood what it meant when someone described a species versus another species. It doesn't really seem that since that time, we've actually been able to come up with one definition for what a species is. But we have identified some characteristics that make species different. So what is a species? Well, species are organisms that have a shared evolutionary history. This means they have ancestors that give rise to the species. They interbreed, which means they can create offspring. And they have distinctive attributes. This would be like their morphology. What other things are there that classify species? Well, currently we have about 1.8 million classified species, and there are probably about 10 million extant species currently on the Earth. Although estimates say there could be from about 5 million all the way up to 50 million. One way that we identify species is through their morphological traits. Morphological traits are macroscopic, so you can see them with the naked eye. They indicate that the organisms have the same form, and they perform the same functions. So these two meadowlarks both have beaks, they both have feathers, they both have wings, they have sharp talons on their toes. These are morphological traits. You can see they have yellow bellies and yellow around their eyes. Again, things that you can visually see. They have a similar appearance. But where do we cut off traits like continuous traits like height or hair color, eye color, things that change and have middle ground and not definitive X or Y answers? When we look at the meadowlarks, they are different species. They do not sing the same songs as mating calls. They don't express the same behaviors in their mating dances. They are not found in the same locations, and they cannot interbreed. They do have the same morphology. Whereas these happy-faced spiders, they have tons of morphological differences, but they're actually the same species. They have different coloring, different patterns. They even have different iridescence in their legs. And you can see some have lines on the top, some with dots. It's a variety of morphological traits, but they are again the same species. In the 1920s, evolutionary biologist Dr. Poulton decided that there had to be some similarities between organisms within the same species. He supported natural selection entirely and felt that all species that were of one type needed to have the same ancestral lineage. They had the same morphology, and they had to be able to interbreed. In addition, he noted that when you look at these two species of butterfly, the same morphology is seen. The same location is where they're found. They even are part of the same genus, but they are different species. They both have mimicry, where they are imitating a poisonous species as a defense against predation, but they are actually two different species. So how is it that we could determine what makes a distinct species? In 1942, the evolutionary biologist Ernst Mayr built on Poulton's ideas, and he found that species can interbreed. But one thing that happens is they must be able to create viable and fertile offspring. Viability is the ability of an organism to survive to reproductive age. Fertility is the ability of an organism to be able to have offspring, and those offspring can have offspring. This is known as the biological species concept. Species can interbreed, forming viable and fertile offspring. A big key to this was through reproductive isolation. Dobzhansky in the 1950s was a geneticist who really expanded on the idea of reproductive isolation. He said morphology just isn't enough to define what a species is. There are too many confounding factors. And so he said they have to undergo reproductive isolation. And they can do this through many forms. They can do it through temporal isolation, where they mate at different times of the year. They can do it through habitat isolation, where they live in different geographic regions. They can do it through gametic isolation, where the zygotes don't form when they mate. They can do it through incompatibility of genitalia, which is mechanical isolation, or they can do it through reduced fertility. So they have no fertility or no viability with their offspring. One issue arose with this, though, in that this interbreeding, we can't identify in extinct animals or organisms. We can't identify it when they're in different geographical locations where we don't know both parts of the species actually exist, and we can't identify it in asexual organisms. So it seems that reproductive isolation is not enough. In 1961, a paleontologist, Dr. Simpson, created an additional idea. He said that each organism that is a new species has to have a separate evolutionary lineage. It goes from ancestor to descendant down a line. The line of descent is known as the lineage, and the lines are evolving. He said each new species comes from a speciation event, and that there's no interbreeding between the ancestral species and the new species, or among other new species. This is known as the evolutionary lineage concept. The way that Simpson attributed this lineage is that there is an original species that branches off into additional species, right? So the idea that these sister taxa could exist was something that was viable then, because it could be continually evolving. However, having one ancestral population suddenly give rise to 4 new species was not a concept that he was supporting at the time. We do know that evolutionary relationships do form from ancestral species to modern species, and we've even seen in the fossil record that we can see ancestors in the fossil record and modern organisms that have descended from them, occasionally finding things that may have come in between, sometimes referred to as transition fossils or transition species. Another way we identify the relationship between organisms is through DNA analysis between the modern species and the ancient species, or fossil evidence. This idea of grouping organisms by classifications is known as cladistics. We often use cladograms and phylogenetic trees to demonstrate these evolutionary relationships. We will talk more about cladistics and phylogenetics in another chapter. Another aspect that we must pay attention to are the ecological factors surrounding speciation, or what species are. One of the things we look at are resources available, which is also called a niche. We look at the habitat and how organisms would adapt to better be suited to their habitat. We address how they forage for food. Maybe one forages on the ground and another forages in a tree. We look at the range of temperatures that they survive and excel in, and we address the behaviors that are exhibited as well. These organisms are found on the north and south rims of the Grand Canyon. These tiny, small, gopher-like creatures look like they could be identical. They are separate species. They've been isolated in separate populations based on the separation from the Colorado River digging the divide of the Grand Canyon. So on the north rim, we have one organism, and on the south rim, a different organism. Same with the squirrels. They have different food foraging patterns. They live in different temperature ranges. They have different habitats and different resources. And although they look morphologically the same, they are different species. In 1976, the evolutionary biologist Van Valen defined niches and said the niche is what defines the species. This is known as the ecological species concept. This defined niche is, for example, with the warblers in this spruce tree. One warbler would feed and live within the darker green portions of the tree. Another warbler species would live toward the middle portion of the tree, and the final species would live toward the top portion. Each of these species is influenced by the environment of the tree. They each have different resources that they use to survive. They have different foraging behaviors and mating behaviors, and they adapt to eating different organisms found on the tree in the different locations. These warblers are all different species living in one habitat, but with a separate niche being exploited by each bird. Another way that scientists separate organisms is by molecular features. These would be things like their DNA. The DNA is a difference in genes, the presence of a gene, the absence of a gene, the order in which the genes are found on a chromosome, or which chromosome the gene is carried on. As well, it could be the number of chromosomes present in the organism, or the order in which the chromosomes are, as well as the structure of the chromosomes themselves. We can see this molecular morphology more clearly when we look at the DNA patterns between the organisms. These blue butterflies look identical, and yet they are two totally different subspecies. One of the things that we struggle with when it comes to the molecular features or the DNA differences are how much of a difference is enough to be considered a new species. Humans, for example, vary within one another in our entire species about 0.5%. So our DNA is about 99.5% identical. The morphological differences among us, the ecological differences, and the evolutionary differences are astounding, but our molecular differences are very minimal. So how much DNA needs to differ before we come up with a new species? In 1998, a zoologist, Dr. Queiroz, expanded on the lineage and said we do have to have evolving lineages, and they are independent from other species. We do have to have a specific ancestry and specific traits. We also have to exhibit reproductive isolation and ecological factors that we adapt to niches. But he says that there's a general species concept, one in which we accept all species having characteristics from each of the previous concepts or the previous ideas leading to new species. This makes the actual idea of defining what a species is incredibly complex. But every day, we learn more and more about what it takes to differentiate between species. Students should be able to differentiate between biological, ecological, and evolutionary species concepts. Students should be able to describe ecological and evolutionary factors that separate species. Students should be able to understand how observations of finches led to Darwin's idea of selection. Students should be able to identify the morphological and ecological factors leading to distinct species. Students should be able to describe the reproductive isolation mechanisms. Students should be able to indicate how the general species concepts define species.